So when I first thought about giving this talk and considered what really fits in with the UU principles, I thought about, of course, interdependence and perhaps generosity. But after listening to Ruth Miller last week, I would also include justice, equity, and compassion. Now, just a caveat before I start, I'm going to make some generalizations knowing that there are a lot of exceptions. So forgive me for making generalizations. So our culture pressures us to achieve and to feel good about ourselves and to be respected by others. So we all crave recognition, that sense of being valued by others. But sometimes we fall short of our own expectations. And we may feel like, well, we're not as valued. So when I was teaching at UC Merced, my TA, my teaching assistant, Claire, confided in me that she only felt good about herself when she weighed less than 150 pounds. And she was able to keep up her 4.0 grade point average. Well, Claire went on to medical school and a residency and now as an anesthesiologist. But I would warn that achievement is just not any substitute for connections with other people. To matter is our assurance that our presence is significant to other people. To matter is feeling like we belong, like when we come together here at FOOF on Sundays. And our service oftentimes will remind us that our life has purpose. So this idea of mattering actually comes up in religions, like in Judaism and Christianity, the idea that we are created in the image of God. And the Hindus have a greeting that just about everybody's heard, Namaste, which means I recognize the divinity in you, and then the other person says it's back to them. So paying attention to someone is a form of generosity, and we're all sharing in that in our FOOF community. When we acknowledge each other, we really see the other person, and we need to make sure that those who matter to us know how we feel about them. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "The worst sin toward another is not hate, but indifference." So after George Floyd's death, the demonstrators took up the slogan, of course, Black Lives Matter. However, things have really changed in the last 30 years or so. There was a man, Robert Putnam, in 1995, he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And his thesis was that we are just not joining groups and organizations to the extent that we used to. In fact, my own father belonged to a bowling league in the 1950s, and he also belonged to a Masonic lodge. So that's changed. So I'm going to give a few statistics that illustrate how some Americans have lost this connection that we used to have that was a little bit stronger. Between 1995 and 2019, the American suicide rate increased by 33%. Between 1990 and 2020, the percentage of Americans who reported they had no friends quadrupled. So spending time with friends went from 7 hours a week in 1999 to half that time by 2019. But of course, there are plenty of exceptions to this rule. Like, for example, Karen and I meet with a couple, Ron and Rhonda, in our neighborhood. And what we do is we have a hike together, and then we have breakfast. And we take turns every other week of who cooks breakfast. And they were our buddies, our pandemic buddies. We continued this practice, and we felt safe while COVID was raging outside. So we all remember the time where people were phoning in their orders for groceries rather than going to the grocery store, which was a bad time. And because for me, one of the bonuses of shopping at Freddy's is sometimes if we're lucky we get to see our friends there. In fact, last week I was going to the dump to recycle some cardboard and I met Brian Longmuir there. And I hadn't seen Brian in 2 or 3 years, so it was great to be able to catch up with him. So what happens when people don't feel as if they matter? If they blame themselves, some people, especially women, become depressed and may turn to things like alcohol and drugs. On the other hand, there are some people who don't blame themselves, but they blame others. They blame society for their feelings of loneliness and isolation. So some of these people, particularly young men, don't have the social skills in order to make friends. But they think to themselves, why doesn't anybody like me? So this lack of connection to other people can turn into hate. And this could lead some of these young men to lash out with a belligerent demand for attention, like, I'll show you. And that may account for some of the mass shootings by these young men. Now, I read about such a young man, Frank, in this book by Rebecca Goldstein, and her descriptions are so much better than I could if I just summarized it, so I'm going to read some of the passages. Frank had grown up in rough South Philadelphia, exposed to violence not only in school and on the streets, but in his home where he lived unprotected and in fear, with a drug-addicted mother and her brute of a second husband, who immediately declared Frank his enemy. You lost the battle the minute I moved in. This is my house now, and you're my prisoner. Frank was 10 years old and had no idea what his stepfather had in mind, but he'd soon find out. He was beaten so often and badly. There were times walking home from school that he tried to get hit by a car. Frank was even addressing him as a retard, telling Frank's mother the sight of her retarded son ruined his appetite. Not once did Frank's mother defend him. When Frank was 14, his stepfather finally threw him out of the house, so he had to go out and live on the streets. The neo-Nazi skinheads paid Frank respectful attention. And this is his words. The white supremacists talked to me like they cared about me, like what I thought and what I could become. They told me I had a destiny. They told me I could become a warrior. They told me all I had to do was look in the mirror and see the truth. I was white, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. Now, this book doesn't have any pictures, but the author, Rebecca Goldstein, saw a picture of Frank during his neo-Nazi days, and she described him, the picture, a photo, as an image of a flaming swastika that adorned his left side of his neck. His chest was tattooed with the image of Joseph Goebbels, the chief of Nazi propagandists, and his knuckles spelled out, skin head. So Frank was smart, and the drive made him a force within his brotherhood of the aggrieved. The drive was fueled by hate and anger. Frank was so damaged that the only brute power in its most primitive form could satisfy it. Eventually, Frank ended up in prison. He kidnapped and tortured a Jewish teenage boy. Frank was arrested and was lucky to get only 3 years. Although only 17, he was incarcerated in an adult prison. When Frank got out of prison, his prospects were dismal. As an ex-felon and an 8th grade dropout on parole for aggravated kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon, sporting a huge swastika on his neck, Frank had trouble finding a job. He was so desperate that Frank took a weekend job with a Jewish high-end antique dealer named Keith in upscale Cherry Hill, New Jersey. At the end of the weekend, Keith thanked me for my hard work, paid me $100 more than the wage he promised me, and asked if I wanted to come and work for him full time. So Keith had a huge impact on Frank, not only in dislodging the final bits of racist ideology from Frank's brain, but also proving his self-image. Frank had a habit of calling himself stupid. One day, Keith lost his temper with Frank and said, "Listen hard to what I'm saying. You're just smart. Get used to it." The tone with which Frank still quotes these words almost with awe is an indication of the effect they had on him. So Frank thought to himself, maybe I should change my beliefs. When people started to talk to me like I was a fellow human, it changed everything. A great deal of Frank's current project is devoted to exposing and fighting the ideology that used to define him. Frank to rein interventions between what he calls the wobbly neo-Nazis, those who aren't yet diehards, and Holocaust survivors, so that these wobblies can engage with the victims of anti-Semitism as human beings, being human, being among human beings. He was a co-founder of Life After Hate, an organization established by former members of hate groups that works to help people leave extremist movements and support their rehabilitation through programs and support groups. In 2020, Frank testified before a House congressional hearing on white supremacy infiltration of police departments, chaired by Maryland Representative Jamie Raskin. He named names, positions, and departments. So the lesson I learned from Keith, Frank's boss, is we should show respect and kindness even to people who don't deserve it. In fact, these people probably need acceptance more than someone who comes from an environment where they're already accepted and appreciated. Oprah Winfrey may have said it best, quote, "There's a denominator in the human experience that we all share. We all want to know that what we do, what we say, and who we are matters. Every argument is about, do you see me? Do I really matter to you?" End quote. So, none of us have all the answers. However, just showing up with an open mind and a open heart will go a long way toward feeling seen and appreciated by others. The good thing is, you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be smart, you don't have to be exceptional. Just a kind word to others is a form of being kind to ourselves. Now, on the negative side, it's quite likely that social media is weakening our social ties rather than the face-to-face interactions we used to have before cell phones. Artificial intelligence could be pushing us more toward an insular world. When artificial intelligence begins to take away jobs, people are going to have to find ways to feel like they have meaning and purpose in their lives, that their jobs fulfilled. So for many of us, especially men, jobs provided an identity and a sense of purpose. The father of psychology, William James, wrote, "The deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated." So if that's true, the worst thing that could happen to anybody is to not feel useful. And I'm going to expand on this concept of feeling useful. When Karen and I were vacationing in 2014, the topic of retirement came up. For Karen, she spent more than 30 years listening to her patients, and she was more than happy to retire here to Florence in 2016. For me, I was less convinced. I didn't think retirement would be a good idea. And the reason I knew I would miss the residents and the faculty docs that I had worked with for 30 years. And I'll tell you why I was really close to the residents. First of all, I taught the psychiatric curriculum, but more importantly, I had support groups for first year residents when they were making that transition from being a medical student, when they only had to pass exams, to now being responsible for patients. And when you're first learning that, they make a lot of mistakes. They're overseen by the second and third year residents, and then eventually an attending physician. But they'll say things like, oh, why did you order an MRI instead of a CT scan? Why did you give a beta blocker to an asthmatic? You know, why didn't you include in your differential diagnosis such and such? I mean, so they're always getting these negative, like they're not good enough. And so support groups really helps them to feel like it's normal. And of course, the issues with senior residents were a little bit different. The other things I did is I organized potlucks where we would rotate. It's usually at a resident's apartment or a faculty's home, where we would, you know, be able to mix socially away from the hospital. I also organized hikes into Yosemite, whitewater rafting, and I was the only faculty that went on the retreat where the faculty took over the hospital on Friday afternoon and let the residents go to the coast for a weekend with their families, and they didn't have to start work again until Sunday night. So that was, and it was all paid for, so that was a really nice time to spend with them. Sorry?
Did you speak up? You're starting to fade.
Oh, okay, sorry. Anyway, so I felt like I had to not only give up my relationships, but I knew that I didn't, until I was reading it and thinking about this, I was really useful. I was really had a part to play in the lives of these residents and the faculty docs. I also taught at UC Merced, and I knew I would miss those residents. And the other thing there, I felt useful because I was the only psych professor that had a science background, so I taught things like alcohol and drugs and neuroscience about the brain and all that sort of thing. So in retirement, I had to find ways to feel useful. And you know, I made friends. We have 2 dogs that need to be go on a hike just about every day, and you know, meeting more and more people, and doing simple things like just feeding the birds that come to our deck every morning, and serving as president of our neighborhood HOA, and enjoying the role of grandfather for our grandson Sam. So after 10 years, I finally am feeling useful again. Okay, to summarize, I'm using this term mattering to be an umbrella term that includes 4 facets of behavior. The first 2 kind of overlap each other. First of all, we want to be appreciated, but don't forget we need to express appreciation to others. Second is the feeling that we are significant to others. And you then need to remember that to express that appreciation to people who are significant to you. Third is to invest your time and energy in others who will in turn invest in you. Fourth is don't be afraid to be dependent on others as well as having others depend on you. So as members of FUV, we embody that interdependence here. But I'll give you another example, although admittedly it's a little bit extreme. I love watching World War II documents, especially when they're interviewing veterans who have been in battles, and they'll talk about a particular battle like Guadalcanal. But when the interviewer asks them, what really kept you going during those horrific conditions? They didn't say, oh, I was wanting the glory of a medal, or that even I was fighting democracy. They said they fought to protect and defend their buddies. They would say things like, well, I knew he had my back and I was gonna have his back. So the soldiers depended on each other for survival. So as a teacher and a clinical psychologist, I've learned from others that deep down inside, all of us are searching for basically the same thing. We want to know that who we are and what we do makes a difference in our community. So our lives, our very existence matters. Thank you.